and thanks for joining us for another edition of Behind the Map. Today, I'm thrilled to be speaking with Warren Davison, a senior content specialist at Esri. Warren works on Esri's ArcGIS storytelling team as a cartographer, artist, and illustrator who tells visual stories through maps and graphics. Before joining Esri, Warren worked as a GIS analyst for the city of Waterloo. Thanks so much for joining me today, Warren. Can you talk a little bit about your interest in mapping and kind of how you got started on this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hi, Robbie. It was kind of a weird one, to be honest. Like, I originally enrolled in university for history. And in that general arts degree, I kind of got a free pick of any courses I wanted to take. I ended up stumbling into a cartography course, which kind of blew my mind because coming from a small high school, like geography class was coloring in an 8.5 by 11 map of the country and labeling capitals and things. So when I found out you could make maps on a computer, I was all in. And from that point on, I switched my major, I switched all my courses. I had to play catch up a little bit. But yeah, absolutely fell in love with it. The mapping side, the technical side, and I was hooked. And that led me kind of to my previous role as a GIS analyst, where mapping was primarily functional. We were focusing on underground infrastructure, addresses, and street trees, finding assets and locating them so that city crews could maintain them. But I ended up pursuing, my own personal cartographic and artistic endeavors with personal projects. So mapping city neighborhoods, bird migrations, which is one of my favorite, and camping trips. And kind of with each of these projects, like I aspired to kind of create these immersive map layouts that incorporated like maps, charts, illustrations, and graphics, where kind of each of those elements would kind of pull you deeper into an aspect of the map and tell like another part of the story. So that's where I've landed.
So you mentioned a little bit about really intentionally trying to pull in some of those graphics and visuals. So can you talk a little bit about how that kind of has influenced your work at Esri?
Thankfully, like mixing these two things, maps and graphics, is like now the best part of my job. Like that's what I get to do all day, which is amazing. Storytelling with maps, helping others do the same. And whether that's creating kind of a poster layout, a kind of static map format, or combining a series of maps in a story map. That's kind of the bread and butter of whatever I do every day, is creating maps, graphics, and photos to kind of tell a story.
We kind of alighted this or kind of glossed over it at the beginning, but I'm assuming you've been an artist and an illustrator for a long time. Have you always kind of been into sketching, and what's sort of your history in terms of your journey as an actual artist?
That's interesting, because like I would argue if you asked anybody, whether they are whatever their professional title is, I think that imposter syndrome kicks in and no one actually says, I'm a specialist or I'm this or that. So like to be honest, I barely think of myself as a cartographer. I don't know if I've like qualified as earning that yet. But I think I'm much further away from artist. I think a lot of it came from, I was completely engrossed in those like cutaway books as a kid where they'd peel off layers of an airplane or a dinosaur and you get to see like the internal systems. And I think that part's really cool because, you see the whole thing from the outside, but to know how, kind of like with a map where you zoom in, it's like you get to know how the internal bits function. And I remember copying, sketching out and replicating all of these kind of cross sections and then doing that with my own drawings. So it's kind of naturally evolved and then stumbling into maps, combining those things to, again, help explain, because you can't necessarily tell the story of any one thing with just one medium. So sometimes it's, combining maps. Sometimes charts are the best way to explain data. Sometimes it's an illustration. So yeah, it kind of all varies, but I think it was just childhood doodling. And I guess I'm still doing that as an adult.
No, I mean, and your maps really are so like well known for incorporating graphics and illustrations within them. I mean, it really is kind of one of those like signatures or trademarks of one of your maps. So, why do you think it's so important to use visuals like illustrations in map-based storytelling?
I think the biggest thing is just the visual delight. Like someone may be completely entranced by looking at a map, but I think the fact is that maps involve like a lot of an abstraction where it's like some person, place, or thing is represented by a symbol. And while that's so powerful for visualizing some phenomena, like they can't always tell, every aspect of the story with just that kind of like visual language. So I like to kind of think about it as like on a map, you're going to have a locator map, which is zoomed out as far as relevant for the story. But I think there needs to be something on the other end of the spectrum that ties whatever you're mapping back to like the real world thing, the subject. So if it's, for instance, like, lions on the savannah, like having a map of, the continent of Africa and then the range of the lion, and maybe there's one specific habitat of interest that's threatened, like having those various scales and then having an illustration of a lion, like that kind of ties everything together across the spectrum. And I think it ties the map's content back to the actual subject. And whether it's a photo or an illustration, I think it does so much to pull the reader in with that kind of visual delight, but also spans the entire kind of scale spectrum when someone's looking at a map. So tying all that together is really good.
So, are there any, I guess, general principles you follow or sort of adhere to when you're thinking about how you want to incorporate visuals like illustrations and graphics into a map?
Again, like I was kind of doing a bit of illustration, a bit of cartography, and like melding those things together. I found that a lot of those cartographic practices carry over. So obviously, like researching is obviously kind of like the first step whenever building a map and you're looking for sources and data sets. When you're going to illustrate something or add those graphics in, you've also got to do that reference material, gathering that reference material, whether they're photos or diagrams, doing that kind of research to get things started. And then a lot of the actual principles of actually creating maps also applies to illustrations and things. So in terms of like hierarchy, if you're creating a diagram of, I don't know, the skeleton of a lion, and let's carry on with that theme. The most important thing is, if you're talking about how that predator consumes its prey, you may want to look at the jaws and things. So when you do that kind of like cross section or cutaway, like the hierarchy to make sure that that skeleton and the teeth stand out as opposed to its leg bones and things. Generalization. There was a project I worked on recently about nuclear power plants. I definitely ended up on a list with how many Google searches I did for the internal mechanisms of a nuclear power plant. But I couldn't explain what I was seeing to a general audience. So there's a lot of generalization. Hot water goes from here to here. This is where it generates steam, etc. So there's a lot of that kind of generalization and even selective omission. If there's a part of the nuclear power plant that isn't relevant, I opted to remove it for clarity. So there's a lot of those kind of like same principles that carry over, those practices that you would use when you're creating a map also apply to creating graphics.
So a lot of maps do use things like video or photography, like more, let's say, less abstracted, more real world representations of whatever it is that they're covering. But your work does tend to favor more abstracted items like graphics and illustrations. So what can you get from a graphic and illustration that maybe you can't achieve with photos and videos?
Well, I don't want to discount those things. Like they are incredibly powerful for visual communication, and they're invaluable for telling stories. But yeah, you're right. I'm definitely biased towards graphics and illustrations. I think part of that comes from the fact that I have greater control over the artistic choices, like where am I looking at this from, or what's the mood of the photo, or what's the color palette. I can draw something exactly how I need it, whereas I may not find a photo that I can use that, shows the subject from that exact angle or, using those colors. But aside from like the aesthetic point of view, like I've also found it so much easier to directly integrate maps with graphics because you can use the same color palettes, textures, symbology. They can almost become an extension of the map. There'll be a lot of cases where I'm using the exact same color palettes that I've used in a map, and I'm using those to do my illustration so that everything is kind of seamless, so that one doesn't stand out more than the other. And that's kind of speaking to the whole visual design and like balance of your composition and things like that. And I think that also helps with storytelling because when you have the freedom of choosing your color palette and textures and things like that, when you're illustrating it from scratch, you can make sure that how you're drawing it matches kind of the tone of the story or the map. One example would be like if I'm doing a graphic story about illegal shipbreaking practices, that's going to have wildly different colors and theme and tone than a map of, golf analytics, which I've done both, so I know how wildly different they are. Although they're both pretty depressing, but for different reasons.
So on that note, and you've already given, I think, a lot of really great kind of food for thought and advice here, but do you have any kind of advice or recommendations for people who maybe want to incorporate more visuals into their mapping stories?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I think the number one I'd like to share is that, again, I don't even necessarily call myself an artist or an illustrator. There's that imposter syndrome, but also trust the process. Because that's become a mantra, I think, of mine, whether it's a map or an illustration or anything. It is a matter of iteration and refining and things. And like the first time I open up a blank canvas and start drawing, it takes a lot to get over that first hurdle of like, oh, geez, this doesn't look good. But like keep adding, keep sketching, keep doodling, and like that the form of whatever you're actually trying to draw will eventually show up and you can kind of refine from there. That first hurdle is really rough though. And it doesn't the other thing I want to share is like it doesn't necessarily have to be this super bespoke illustration or chart or graphic. Like a lot of the time just a sketch or something will communicate enough. And maybe it works perfectly with the tone of your story, like it's not supposed to be refined. But at the end of the day, like maps and graphics, they're all forms of visual storytelling, and it's simply a matter of choosing the best medium for whatever the job is. Like there's going to be times where data is best communicated with a chart as opposed to an illustration or a map. And so whatever best communicates the point of that thing or of your story to your reader is the tool to use.
I think that's actually a great place to end. So thank you so much for spending time with us today. This was a fascinating conversation and I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.